Thank you, everybody. My hubris stretches as far as shalom, so unfortunately, I'm really sorry. If I repeat anything that has already been said, I don't know. Before I say anything else, thank you for the introduction, thank you for inviting, and I like to invite you. I explain that a little bit further later on, but there is some plasticine, and I was very pleased to see that Ali already picked a piece. If every single person in this room could please take a small piece of the plasticine, you will find out later. So if you pass it around, and just all as we go along, we will discover what it's for. The first thing I'd like to say really is it was really great to see the graduate show yesterday, and thank you so much, Moran and Barra, to show us around. And what emerged from walking around was that we're really tackling with similar themes across the globe, it seems: inequality, diversity, interdisciplinarity, making, materiality, collaboration. And you mentioned collaboration. And in the spirit of collaboration with you, this is why I'd like to invite you today to collaborate with me as I go along with this talk. There will be a few interventions that will only work if you help me and if we work together. So you said this is a start. I also see this as a start. So if you are happy to go with the flow, be my passenger. So, okay, the first thing then to do, as we were talking yesterday, at the end we kind of came to the conclusion that we all somehow struggling with the tension between the freedom within our learning environments, but then there's also the methodologies. And perhaps the methodologies that we have developed, they aren't right for our current environment anymore. Perhaps we need to think about different methodologies. And the other theme we touched on, the diversity. So then let's think together about what role does collaborative learning play in acknowledging the benefits of diversity, and how can we embrace this in our learning environment. So as I go through this presentation, share some of my examples and my own experiences, failures, achievements, I'd like you to bear this in somewhere in the back of your mind. And this is me in the crossing of Central St. Martin's. If you've visited, you may have seen it. It's a very public space of our space. And I thought I'd introduce myself, Associate Dean, what does that really mean for teaching and learning? Some people think it's a very bureaucratic job. It's not how I do my job. And I want to show you a performance I did with 3 colleagues. And then I will explain later once you've seen it. Oh, the sound. It's disappeared, it won't. Oh, we have to switch. Is called 59 minutes and 59 seconds. and it was an unruly performative piece which overlaid readings of various texts with musical loops. It was performed by the Defiant Dilettantes as part of Creative Unions at Central St. Martin's. Just very briefly, Creative Unions was an initiative when the referendum happened, and we were absolutely shocked what this will mean to a cultural institution like ours and what it will impose on us. And we would not be in control of many of those things. Central St. Martin's, our students were the first students to go and protest in front of the Parliament, and we took that as a first step to create something called Creative Unions, where many of our colleagues and practitioners, and we invited the public to work with us against something like this. Unfortunately, we haven't quite managed to stop it, but who knows what can happen. So the piece was created by 4 artists, and my colleagues and myself, so we all come from different disciplinary backgrounds. The project began with my frustrations about Brexit and completing the 85 pages application for permanent residency. Until then, I didn't need this. I'm a European citizen, and there was no need for me to apply for this. I have a European passport. Another colleague of mine had the same, so together we thought about, okay, what does this mean now to become a British citizen? Do we really want to become a British citizen? Through collaborating, engaging, and with responding differently to the materials, adding, subtracting, and questioning extracts of text, the project expanded. So Graham and David, the 2 colleagues, who also joined with their expertise in sound art, and the collaboration and our rehearsals were an important part of the process of developing the piece. During this live performance, the audience was invited to participate, becoming part of the actual performance, extending the nature of the collaboration. Because it was a public place, there were certain rules that were imposed on me, as I was they called me the mastermind of it, but I was inviting, but that's not right for collaboration, I think. But there were ethical implications in terms of children walking through, so I had to make sure nobody was swearing in the environment, and just things like that. So on reflection, for me, this project relates to border zones, which you saw in my title. And it's something I will come back to throughout this presentation. And it refers to in multiple ways. The content addressed political and historical borders. The participatory element raised questions about ethical and psychological borders. And throughout the production, borders became a dynamic phenomenon that emerged, disappeared, and re-emerged, having a transitional character as being internal zones of negotiation. In this sense, the borders were not seen as barriers, but often thought of by the participants as points of contact. I will say a little more about borders later in relation to a European project I've worked on. So when I think about interdisciplinary projects and collaboration, when I come across beautiful quotes, I think this is beautiful like this, I'll let you read it for a moment. So this is really not about losing your own identity, but it's actually sharing your identity, and something new can emerge from it. And sometimes it's hard for us to think, oh, okay, what kind of tools or methods can we use to enable such process? And I'd like to invite you now into such process. It's called Forced Connections. You may have come across this. So there are dies around the tables, but because when I started laying them out, there were few people in the room. So what we need to achieve in the next 30 seconds, 3 people and 1 die. If you could please arrange that. 3 people, 1 die. act very quickly. There's some die on the table. If you pass some to the back, let's collaborate, let's work fast. This is only the first step, so everybody please, 3 people, 1 die. Are there 3 people without a die in this room? Please pass them around. Do we have, are there any more 3 people without a die? Please lift your hands. Are we all okay? Are we all okay? Yes? So what's going to happen next is, we all ready, yes? Are we all ready? 3 people, 1 die. Great. I'll go back to that in a minute. So, I'm taking a shortcut. This is not normally, I show the whole exercise to you, but in terms of time constraints, I had to do this. And I thought, and thank you to my colleagues yesterday, I thought, okay, what's your environment? What may you be working on here? And I may get this totally wrong, and please tell me. But the purpose of this now is, in your groups of 3, you are going to throw, the first person is going to throw the dice, and let's say you have number 4. You would circle this, practitioners, in your head, or make a note on your piece of paper. Then the next person throws the die, and let's say it's number 2. Create a master plan. So I show you what it looks like. So it could look like, so this is chance, random, because the die will decide which part of the column you will be thinking about. So, if you could please, all of you, 3 times in your groups, throw the dice. I'm going to ask you, Adi, make a start. Okay, Adi has number 4, so that will be practitioners and Bezalel. Are we all clear? If not clear, please ask. Are we all clear? Can we just have silence? Silence, please. Silence. I did a workshop once for 2 days, 3 days, and silence was always like this. I don't know if this translates into your culture. Huh? This is the Middle East. Okay. Where was the workshop? In Denmark. Are we all clear? So, 1 person, 1 die. You should have all now chosen something in the people column. Next one is the purpose. Have we all thrown the dice twice? Yes? Yes? Okay. And then the last one, places. Okay? Great. So you should have... Thank you, Adi. You're the boss. So now, I'd like you to spend 5 minutes. 5 minutes with this, what may look like a very odd combination. I'd like you to think for 5 minutes, how could you start writing in your head a proposal for a project? What would that look like? How would you engage with this? I can see you just starting to have fun. But unfortunately, we don't have enough time. But I'd like to, I think you get the idea. I use this a lot. I will come to that later. When I teach groups about collaboration, for example, this is about leadership in collaborations and democratic approaches. And how can you create some low hierarchy where everybody, the die decides what you're going to do. And it really opens up possibilities. And it shows in a group who's making the decisions here. And you know, sometimes when we work collaboratively, there is a dominant person, etc., etc. But in a way, I've always found this as a really useful tool. I'm happy to share all of this with you. This is how you would do it. So in terms of thinking also, it's the creative and the critical. But it's I found it a really good tool to start a process when you're trying to work in collaboration. So this is what you would give the group. So there would be an empty sheet, and it actually starts with a brainstorm of those kind of, what kind of people would you like to work with? What kind of purpose is the project? What kind of places are involved? So that's how you would start. So just very briefly. So I'm just going to move on and share another example of mine, which relates to some of the work I saw yesterday because it involved science. So Broad Vision was an art science learning and research program which ran across the faculties of media, art and design, science and technology at the University of Westminster. This is where I worked before I worked at St. Martin's. So it ran there from 2010 to 2015. And each year the program brought together tutors, 3 teaching assistants, and approximately 30 second year undergraduate students from disciplines including biosciences, contemporary media practice, illustration, imaging science, photographic arts, and psychology. And the program created an interdisciplinary space for collaboration and co-creation, as well as an exchange and exploration of different research and working practices. And these were the different environments we were working in, and we always referred to it as an environment of like the discovery. A creative experimentation takes place by working with different materials, processes, and protocols. And the studio, the laboratory, workshop, or classroom, and it really opened up the dialogue between students and tutors or teachers. And the program encouraged interdisciplinary learning by introducing a core stimulus, such as the use of microscopes, a set of images, or a theme, establishing a central focus for interpretation and exploration. And this mode of learning created a liminal space, inviting students and tutors to synthesize methods and procedures. For example, an artist sculpting with scientific material, leading to unfamiliar working practices. And this approach challenged preconceptions of the various disciplines involved and led to new ways of interpreting and representing the world around them. Furthermore, it introduced both artists and scientists to a new set of materials, enhancing individual practice by embracing work methods to other disciplines. So here are some of the reflections that students shared with us later. I'll just leave you to read that. Can you see it in the back as well? Yeah. So this was by an art student. This one is by a science student. And bear in mind, these are second year undergraduate students. I'd say it's the maturity of this. I saw a lot of that maturity in the work by your students when I was walking around the show yesterday. This is a psychology student. So just to give you a flavor, am I going too fast? No? These are 2 students In the lab. This is an illustrator, this is a bioscientist.
If this goes to manufacture, which doesn't have to be because we sort of a smaller installation that's simpler, but we present these designs that are refined as well. But if this goes to manufacture, I've actually probably got to land in CAD. So,
yeah, well, maybe.
It's really interesting. So the artwork has moved into the bioscience lab, and suddenly they're both there in the lab codes, and it just really, it's many of the students said it was a very transformative experience. But obviously, interdisciplinary working doesn't come without its challenges. I think we all know that. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Carl Gombrich. He used to run the BSc BA at UCL, the ever first interdisciplinary bachelor, and he's now moved on to the London Interdisciplinary School, which is a very new institution, and he is heading up the teaching and learning there. But I thought this is, you know, assessment is a challenge, let alone assessing your own discipline, but actually when you go into other disciplines and you address assessment there from an area where you may not be, you know, who are you to judge something of a different disciplines, it becomes even more challenging. So the conversations that you have with your teams are super important. And there are, in the world, with everything, there are the cynics. So Mitchell questioned whether interdisciplinary is a grab bag of problems left over from respected and well-established disciplines. And that's okay. I think it's important that we have disagreements and then we can start the conversation and understand the different perspectives we are coming from. So I'm moving on to a bigger picture, which is a unit at Centre St. Martin's that I work on with a colleague. It goes across 4 undergraduate courses. It's ceramic design, graphic design, architecture, and product design. It brings together 350 undergraduates, and where do I Oh yes, so I'm thinking about the value of, it's very important, I think, when working across discipline. It offers the opportunity to focus on developing students' skills in areas such as self-direction, confidence, interpersonal relationships, curiosity, and that's my tongue, no? I have 5 more minutes. So that's I call that a human-centered approach, which is what we focus on with this unit at Centre St. Martin's, which basically, it's collaborative, the students work collaboratively, and they're exploring the values of the university in relation to questions of design theory and practices through cross-disciplinary and intercultural interactions. So the values are very much sustainability, diversity, inclusivity, and that's what the students tackle in the briefs that they use. And Kieran Mahir, my colleague who I work with on this unit, he described the teaching and learning methods that we employ throughout the duration. It's from knowledge transmission to social learning. And I'm not suggesting that this is a new concept, because if you look at John Dewey, Paulo Freire, John Piaget, or Lev Vygotsky, you may or may not have come across these individuals, but they have discussed these forms of learning for quite some time. And just another example of what we do in this unit, we have an amazing museum and study collection at Centre St. Martin's, and we work with them, and we bring the objects from the collection out into this is our street. So we had 350 students, 70 objects, and about 14 tutors working with the students. And it's exploring stories, telling stories through the object. So it's a different way of engaging with, you're thinking about something, you're learning about how somebody else interprets this object. Everybody comes, so it's a very diverse student cohort. Everybody comes with a different background, a different story, and this is a way of enabling, so it's like, it becomes less personal if you talk what you would like to talk about through the objects, and people are exchanging amazing things. So you have a forensic viewing and an emotional viewing of the objects, and that's what the students engage with. Okay, and in reflection, these are the kind of comments students would share with us at the end. And yes, there are, I like these things. I'm not interested in social engagement project as a career. So after the 5 weeks of this unit, the student said, I really don't want to do that. But they're not all like that. They are different interpretations of it. They really like, you know, how much they learn from the other different disciplines. They understand the importance of collaboration and how how important it is to listen and don't respond emotionally, and all these areas. And these are really, really important things in the world we are living in, how we can work together. So this really moved me. So the students write a reflective piece at the end, and I'd like you to read it for yourself. You see, with all the challenges that comes with running a unit of that size, and then you have an individual really understanding what this does and how they can progress in their own discipline, having engaged in this process, it just makes it real. It makes it worthwhile, all the work that goes into it, and that this individual will work very differently in architecture from here on. Do I have time to talk about, very briefly? Yes? Yes. Yeah? Okay. Okay, this is over to you. Just 1 minute. You all have a piece. You all come from different disciplines. Just engage with your neighbor for 1 minute or 30 seconds. What did you think about the plasticine? I saw quite a lot in the art shop here. I was very pleased about that. I didn't need to bring it all the way from the UK. Sorry. Hello? Hello? I'm sorry if my question wasn't clear. I'd like you to talk to your neighbour. What you make, what does this material mean to you? What do you associate it with? Does it remind you of your childhood? Does it remind you of your practice? Do you want to dissect it? Do you want to photograph it? Do you want to paint it? Okay, okay. Anybody who would like to share? Hello? You are really great. You are so engaged in the activities. You have a fantastic audience. But I have to stop you because I'm going to get in trouble for running over. Any immediate thoughts on this material? Anything you'd like to share? Anybody? Yeah. You don't have to. You're going to go to the shop and buy some? Yeah. The reason I wanted to share this with you is because I worked from 2015 to 2018 on what I call, on reflection, a very challenging European project. And CSM was, I was the CSM lead, so the lead at Central Martins for an Erasmus strategic partnership. It was called the European Academy of Participation. And the project set out to establish a broadly shared benchmark in the European higher education area for all those education providers that wish to extend their existing curricula with a specialization or additional provision in the area of participatory art. It sounds terrible, doesn't it? So basically what we were hoping to achieve was to create a master program that can be taught across. There were 10 European partners involved, and the idea was that it can be taught in any of those areas in Europe, and the student could travel, and depending on the context, that's the kind of curriculum they would do. So we ran a number of pilots. The first one was in London, and I wanted you to engage in something I call a more common material. So here you can see some of the students using something very common, a loaf of bread, and making sculptures out of it. But actually, it got us to think. We often think about the human when we talk about collaboration, but what actually happens when we think through the material? And especially if we come from different disciplines in different countries, etc., there is a very different conversation that happens there. So through this project, we did explore methods and techniques for learning from each other, creating an environment of discovery, and so we used the common materials to encourage material thinking, and actually that term was coined by Paul Carter, an architect. I don't know if you have come across him. So here you can see people discussing how they felt about working with this, and all of this was always in preparation, because one thing we learned, so when we discuss the benefits of working across disciplines, we often focus on the interactions between the participants. But what about the interactions with the material of each discipline, which is what, so in Broad Vision we have that. And this takes me back to the borders. So the concept of borders I touched on earlier, as it provides a useful frame within which to explore the idea of a pan-European collaboration. Borders can function in multiple ways, as barriers, allowing access only to a selected few, as a mechanism for safeguarding, protecting the status quo of a specific territory, or as an indication of entering the unknown, challenging limitations, to expand perspectives, and to grow knowledge. The latter can create safe zones of inquiry that, if each partner engages responsibly with the cultural, social, and political context in which the collaboration is taking place, have the potential to become fruitful regions within the borderland. These regions can act as a catalyst for the development of cultures in between, a permanent state of transition in the positive sense of producing creativity and diversity. So the participants of the European Academy of Participation experience borders in various forms and from varying positions, both in its content and its context. It both addressed political and historical borders, such as East and West divide. So we had Romania was, for example, one partner, very different to France or Holland or Germany or the UK, Ireland, Portugal. These are some of the countries that were involved. And very different perspectives on contemporary politics. And the participatory element of the project raised questions about ethical and psychological borders, including power structures, institutional differences, and the nature of participation. So in terms of institutional differences, we had NGOs, we had what's called in the UK the third class sector, so charities, we had universities, and we had cultural institutions like the Goethe Institute. So we were tackling with the different languages, the different cultures of the institutions, different individuals. We had students who were from China studying in Germany, but actually doing the pilot in Bucharest. We had students who were refugees from Syria, who had refugee status then in Germany, coming to work with us in London. There were so many different stories that came together. And that's why, whilst it was challenging, I know for myself, I learned an awful lot about it, and I would, it lasted for 3 years, and you'll be pleased to know I'm engaging in another project from autumn, different countries, only 4 this time rather than 10. I think that was the wise decision. And this is where I will end. And yes, we can, I think we should maybe revisit those questions when we've heard Mark, because they kind of covered what we talked about yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you, Silke. That was really good. I don't have anything as exciting or engaging or as interactive as Silke has. I don't work in an art school. I work in a media school. My background is in production, so I spend my days watching television and reading theory, as will be evident from my presentation. Can't hear you well. Is it on? So, I want to talk a bit about creativity, because I think that's a key concept in art schools and in media faculties. And I want to think about creativity in relation to technology and what the implications are when we think about artistic agency. And my starting point for this was a gift that I was given earlier this year, which is a sandwich toaster. So I want to spend half an hour or so talking about my sandwich toaster. The reason why this is an interesting sandwich toaster is that it promises to turn on your creativity. To turn on your creativity. So I want to think a bit about what that might mean, to turn on your creativity. Whether this is something that can be effected technologically. There are certainly lots of promises about turning on your creativity. So my talk is not about, it's not a critique of sandwich toasters, but it is a critique of the concept of creativity. And I think this is a kind of a provocation or a catalyst that enables us to think about creativity, perhaps in a, you may all be thinking critically about creativity already, and if so, I apologise because I may be duplicating, but I think for me, I'm kind of working towards something. I'm currently trying to write an article which starts with my sandwich toaster, so this is a kind of thinking in progress. And because of my age, and because I work in a media faculty and I watch a lot of television, I want to start with just a 4-minute compilation of clips of television. So I spend my days watching, because I'm 50 plus, I watch TED Talks and listen to Radio 4 and watch programmes about houses and gardening and cooking. And from that, I have compiled a little selection of clips in which this idea of creativity is mobilised. People talk about it, they use it as if it's something that we all understand. So, we're going to start with Ken Robinson, who you may be familiar with, whose TED Talk, How Schools Are Killing Creativity, provides the foundation for a lot of this. So if you're familiar with that one, we then move on to Giles Fraser, the Anglican priest and polemicist, and then a range of popular television.
And my contention is all kids have tremendous talents and we squander them pretty ruthlessly. So I want to talk about education and I want to talk about creativity. My contention is that creativity now is as important in education as literacy, and we should treat it with the same status.
The connection between the ability to let our minds wander and creativity is pretty obvious to anyone who's watched a child play. My 1-year-old does things with coloured bricks that wouldn't occur to most adults. Every child is an artist, explained Picasso. The problem is staying an artist when you grow up.
The whole atmosphere is about how metal goes together, how it can block the light, how it can allow light through it. Real creativity with a single, simple, cheap material. But actually, I think what Piers and I would like Martin to look at is materials that have a story to them.
Lynn's taken many self-built body blows, but in the process learnt to be resilient. She's shown her realism, her creativity in the face of adversity, sacrificing even her concrete floor for a resin one.
We were born to manage an art gallery, Russ. Curating new exhibitions and painting your own wonderful pieces.
I hope this will kickstart my creativity.
Oh, it's bound to.
because they kind of projected this piece out over the living space. You've got quite a cosy little living area, and then this spectacular new room. So it's spatially ingenious, but it also has this incredible kind of playful creativity with decoration.
With the title in sight, they are about to be pushed to the limit of their creativity, skill and determination.
Madeline wants to remodel the first floor of her home to provide her with an office space for creativity and a new luxurious bathroom.
Craig Treadwell, a maverick rule breaker and head chef at a restaurant famed for its wild creativity, is flying the flag for the central region.
I don't think the competition is going to get any easier from now. There's great chefs with great dishes and great scores.
I just let my mind speak, so
there is no spontaneity in there, there is no creativity. Both of them are absolutely flat. It's too considered. There's no sort of passionate washing.
Featuring scallops and turnip, plus English wasabi, a dashi broth and kombu, it scored 28 out of 40 in the regional final. As while the judges appreciated its delicacy, they felt it didn't gel as a whole.
We liked this dish a bit-ish. I'm not so sure about the ingredients going together. I mean, I think the wasabi, you either like or you don't like it.
Do you like?
Not really, but maybe together. You know, I'm just kind of intrigued to see what kind of creativity.
I think it's one of those things that needs to be done with a very light touch.
Yeah.
Like many of us, Tom and Zoe are overwhelmed by what surrounds them, and it clouds their creativity. So what will they make of Piers' ideas for downstairs?
Avocado smoothie is a step too far and I find it far too sweet. This reminds me of the chocolate sauce with the basil.
I don't mind creativity, I'll applaud creativity, but this is going too far.
In terms of artistry and creativity, I mean, if we take two gardens, there's the M&G garden, my kind of surgeon, which seems to me to have a huge amount of creativity, and it looks as though it's beautifully made, but most people don't get a chance to inspect that. And then you have another garden of which perhaps the Welcome to Yorkshire is a good example, which is brilliantly made, but clearly not creative in the same way.
Yeah. Throughout the competition, Steve has shown technical flair and creativity with some highly original combinations.
This is cooking of the highest order.
Wow, that is truly creative.
But sometimes he puts his experimental vision above flavoursome food.
Some people would say this is creativity gone too far.
It starts to become nonsensical after a while, doesn't it? It starts to lose its meaning. So we had a range of different versions of creativity there, a range of different uses. You know, Ken Robinson talks about this idea of creativity being innate and that it's then squandered. It's often a visible quality, so it's beyond the person, it's something that inheres within products or activities. It's often something that is dormant, we can talk about that a little bit later, that needs to be activated. It's often associated, so we have these sort of metonymic links with playfulness and ingenuity and inventiveness and novelty. The one that made you laugh and always makes me laugh is the woman who wants to have an office space for creativity and a luxurious bathroom. It's a sort of afterthought. So it's something that environmentally can be facilitated. It's often a maverick quality. It's about rule breaking. It's about wildness. And this untamed quality is something that discursively we find again and again. It's often a visible quality. So in the makeup program, and I've said that language breaks down because people often are looking, they can't, when tested, it's often something that can't be expressed. So she was looking for some verbal, you know, like a paralinguistic kind of whoosh, in order to express the thing she was trying to get at. So it's often something that emerges, consequently it can be something that's stifled and clouded, something that can go too far sometimes, you know. So in the cooking program, I applaud creativity, but this is a step too far. And lots of these programs involve judgments and assessments and measurements, which begs the question, how much is too much and how much is enough? And is there a sort of Goldilocks version of creativity? My point is that it's incoherent. And actually, even amongst specialists, you will find disagreements and you will find different assumptions and preconceptions and prejudices about creativity. So what we find is that there's an attempt to mobilise it, to operationalise it. This is from a UK campaign about the creative industries, telling us that actually we must invest in the creative industries. We must celebrate, as it says here, films like The King's Speech, artists like Adele, films like Harry Potter, architecture like the Gherkin, because they pay. You know, it's a £71.4 billion industry, the creative industries. And I would say this is a kind of technologisation of creativity. So back to my toaster, which promises to turn on my creativity. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm hoping. We find lots of examples where technology is supposed to enhance your creativity. And these are linked with very familiar metaphors. So open your doors to a lifetime of creativity. It's that unlocking metaphor. Taking control of your creativity as if it's, again, something that needs to be released but tamed and kept in check. These are all software, obviously. Shutterstock, your creativity is hungry, it needs to be nourished or nurtured. That's another discursive, metaphorical realm that we find. Creativity lives in the cloud, so it can be facilitated by that environment. It's something you can immerse yourself in. Again, another environment from Adobe. And the Mac, of course, is built for creativity on an epic scale. And the iPad will push your creativity, so it just needs to be edged in the right direction. And this is a really interesting one because now we start to move into pedagogy. So this is an Apple advert, and it's about igniting the creativity in every student. So the mode of address changes here. So previously it's been your creativity, so it's been some promise to self-actualize. But here the address is to educators. So this is how you might activate the creativity in your students. So let's look a bit more closely at the wording of this one. So ignite, I've highlighted words that I think are significant. So ignite the creativity of the student. We have the Ken Robinson idea of every child being born full of creativity. It's a kind of, the Romantic poets were keen on this idea that children were born trailing clouds of glory, and it was actually the world that sullied them. But you know, we need to nurture the thing that they're born with. Through nurturing it, it makes your students better communicators and problem solvers. It prepares them to thrive in today's world. We find this metaphor again, the unleashing the creative potential through tools, inspiration, in order to create magical learning. So what's going on here? Discursively, what's going on? And I'm really interested in language and rhetoric, and I think language creates the world, it creates meanings, it creates the terrain that we operate within with each other. But there are some contradictions here. So apparently every child is born full of creativity, but how do you know? How do you know until it is evidenced, until it's activated, until it reveals itself? These metaphors were all there. You know, it can be ignited and nurtured and unleashed. But aren't these different things? You know, there's a violence associated with ignition that isn't associated with nurturing. And unleashing, again, suggests that the violence is already there, this thing that is perhaps wild and needs to be tamed. In that advert, creativity is also this thing that has utility. So it's a means to an end. It will lead you somewhere. It will enable you to thrive, or to be a good communicator, or a good problem solver. Interestingly, sometimes those are synonyms themselves for creativity, problem solving and communicating. And tools can create the magic. So the very material realm of technology and tools can activate this immaterial realm of magic. And the magic of creativity, it's something that we find often, and it eludes rational technologization, which is why it sits so uncomfortably with these attempts to technologize it. And it's often used, I think, as a bit of a code word, or a shibboleth. It's creativity is one of those kind of access words that opens up a world that we think we understand, but actually we're often using it in very, very different ways. So I'm thinking about the toaster again. I did use it for some old polenta once. I don't know if that makes it creative. And some broccoli stems. Was I pushing the boundaries of my creativity? I don't know. I'm still not sure that I've been turned on or turned myself on. So I think it's important to ask, what do we talk about when we talk about creativity? Particularly in an art school environment, certainly in my media faculty, where this term often appears in assessment criteria. Now the stakes then become high, because if we're using this as a word by which we assess students, we have a huge responsibility to explain what we mean by it, and not to rely on the magic, not to say, oh, well, you know it when you see it. I don't think that's good enough. So when we use it, let's think about what terms of relation are involved. Are we talking about creativity that inheres within something? Are we talking about it as if it characterises a process? Is it a personal attribute? So where is the connection? And how do we talk about that? You know, what are the implications for turning on creativity? I'm still struggling with that. You know, can one activate it oneself? Or do you need an environment and a teacher to activate it for you? And crucially, when we ask these questions, and when we try to answer these questions, what do we reveal about our own investments, our own personal prejudices, predilections? And this is a slight sidestep, but a complementary one, I hope. When I say, what do we talk about when we talk about creativity? It always reminds me of Raymond Carver, the modern American author. Most famous work, perhaps, what we talk about when we talk about love. And that's become a bit of a sort of a pattern we find in other books as well. Now, Raymond Carver is an interesting example because he was renowned for his terse prose style, very pared back, very minimal, very lean. However, according to the recent history, his prose style wasn't actually his own. It was a product of his editor, Gordon Lish, and Gordon Lish subsequently tried to take credit for it, for revising Carver, for giving Carver, for actually making Carver, for becoming the Carver style, which of course makes us think about Foucault, and Foucault's notion of the author, and the author being this product of a whole range of complex processes, editorial processes, reading processes, texts and paratexts. If we buy into this, and I don't think this is too controversial anymore, we start to question the idea of the autonomous creative agent. We start to think that that autonomous creative agent is something that is itself a product of a range of social, political and educational processes. So if we come back to this idea of creativity being turned on, it suggests that it's some kind of force that's been imprisoned, but that can be released. You know, if I can turn on my own creativity, then to use another Foucauldian construction, I can release it. I've incarcerated it. It's a kind of a power move against my own incarcerating self. And that reminded me again of somebody else who talked about turning on, which is Timothy Leary, who of course used the technology of drugs. So in Timothy Leary's world, the idea of everyone taking acid was a great way of releasing and turning on the incarcerated self. But it's something we own, apparently, but it's also something that we need to claim. It's innate and essentially human quality, but at the same time, it needs to be unlocked, it needs to be tamed. But this idea of turning on uses a different discourse. It uses a more mechanistic discourse. It technologizes it, which might remind us of Richard Sennett in his book The Craftsman, who talks about technology. You know, is technology a friendly tool or an enemy replacing the work of the human hand? There are contradictions here that we can't resolve easily, that we need to work through, we need to acknowledge. And Ishiguro actually got to something really important about creativity in this novel, Never Let Me Go, where I apologise in advance for the spoiler if you haven't read it or seen the film, but this is based on a boarding school with a group of children, and the children are under great pressure to prove that they are creative. And Tommy in particular, his reputation for creativity was as low as ever. And but it was quite possible that one day he'd prove that he was creative. And we're not quite sure why this is so important, why the stakes so high. And it's revealed later in the novel, because this is a sort of dystopian near future, that all of these children are actually clones, and they've been produced to provide organs for people. But the teachers in this school want to prove that these children are human, that they have souls. And one way of proving they have souls is to show that they can paint, they can write poems, they can do the creative stuff. So culturally, I think we have this sort of deep commitment to the idea of creativity as evidencing this essential humanity, which is difficult when you're trying to technologize it. Yet we allow, in a kind of dissonant way, these two ideas to coexist. Again, kind of going back to Foucault, let's start to think about practices. This is about practices generally. Let's think about artistic practices as being subject to the same scrutiny. You know, we need to relate all practices to social phenomena, knowledge, ability, valuation, power, language, institutions. And artistic practices shouldn't be immune from that, no matter how invested we are in them. So it's really important to start to critique the things that we cherish the most, I think. So if we start to think about that kind of little fissure that's been opened up by thinking about technology, and what does technology force us to address about what we believe about creativity, we need to start asking questions, particularly in arts education. So, questions about what do we mean when we talk about intention, for example? Because intention suggests the autonomous, unified, artistic self that is the product of meaning and the source of creative outcomes. Aim and design and outcome and passion, how are these things made meaningful within the discourse of arts education? And crucially, how are judgments made? And we talked a little bit yesterday about assessment, and judgments is just a broader word for assessment. So, how are judgments made on the basis of this idea of artistic agency, individual agency, the autonomous self? And how are differentiations made? So how do we, first of all, make a judgment about whether something counts, and secondly, how do we differentiate between other things that may also count? One way of differentiating is to argue that there are different levels of creativity. I mean, Anthony Storr, writing in the, I can't remember the book right now, but he differentiates between everyday expression and creativity. So he actually said, you know, many people are not impelled to use their talents for anything more than the decoration of a house or a sketchbook. They do not express their daydreams in a creative fashion. Ken Robinson would argue the opposite, but actually all expression is creative and it represents creativity. That's tricky when you're trying to make differentiations, when you're trying to create different levels. We also find hierarchies emerge when we talk about craft. So in the UK, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport had to try, this is all part of the technologisation of creativity, codified the different industries. So we had a range of codes that were applied to things like computer games, IT, software development, the art and antiques market got in there. And those people who considered that they were properly creative started to object to the fact that the art and antiques market was in there because they didn't necessarily do original creative stuff. They were just involved in retail. Similarly, people in marketing were criticised. So as soon as you try to pin it down, as soon as you try to mobilise it, to institutionalise it, to technologise it, all of the prejudices and the predilections come out again. Nesta tried to solve it. Nesta is the National Endowment for Sciences, Technology and the Arts. So they tried to come up with a definition that talked about cognitive skills being brought to bear on newness, which called back to Ken Robinson's formulation that creativity was about the production of original things that have value. But interestingly, even though they tried to pin it down, we have this point number 2, that creativity is characterized by things that are resistant to mechanization. And okay, it's whether the occupation has no mechanical substitute, but there's still that tension around mechanization and technology, similarly expressed in the non-repetitiveness or the non-uniform function. So we can't resolve that, despite the fact there's some really high-level thinking about this. As soon as you start to think about technology and creativity, the whole idea of the autonomous artistic agent becomes problematic. And other people have waded into the craft debate. You may be familiar with Grayson Perry, the Turner Prize-winning artist, who says, I call myself mockingly a conceptual artist masquerading as a craftsperson. He also said it was harder to come out as a transvestite than it was as a craftsman. Thus, I think, invoking some of the problems around being a craftsperson in the art world. Because, you know, the art world has historically been a bit sniffy about the craft, because the craft is associated with mechanization, repetition, and commerce as well. So we need to recognise when we talk about, well, that's not really creative, but we might be drawing on some of these prejudices as well. So I like to do what I call a kind of anti-ontology of creativity. So rather than seeing creativity as a thing that exists, it's actually a phenomenon. It's a discursive product. So let's start asking different questions about it. So when we make statements about it, what kinds of tensions are evident in those statements? What kinds of things are legitimised or left out, delegitimized? To what extent are we making it dependent on the idea of this autonomous, organic, non-mechanistic agent? How's this whole concept produced conceptually through talking, through language, through rhetoric, through ideology? And crucially, for us, how is that then used explicitly or implicitly in making pedagogic judgments? So when we're confronted with a piece of coat hanger sculpture that gets a grade C, what's going on in those assessment processes? You know, it is legitimate. Here we have a student who's quite willing to engage in a dialogue about the mode of assessment and the nature of the assessment process. You know, was I judged on the piece of sculpture itself? If so, is it not true that time alone can judge a work of art? So sort of engaging in the whole temporal dimension around products, but also talent. You know, can I be judged on my talent? I have no control over my talent. Are you making assumptions about my autonomous, organic, creative agency? And I think these are the kind of conversations that probably are quite valuable, particularly with collaborative work that Silke was talking about, where are we judging the source or the locus of that original creative work? So back to my toaster. We come full circle. And as I said, I didn't come to criticise toasters. I came to criticise the notion of creativity and using this as a little bit of a lever to crack open the discourse. And I think what it does is speak to a contemporary desire to technologise and operationalise creativity. By asking the right questions about it, we can reveal that we maybe are similarly limited in our thinking about creativity. I don't think I've managed to turn mine on yet, but I am going to try and toast some more interesting things and just see what happens.
We have like 15 minutes of questions and answers, and I would like to maybe start with this with one question, and then we can follow the other. Then relate to those two talks that you gave. It seems to me that there is an underlying kind of assumption, right, in everything that you show us, that learning is a social action in essence. And I think there is another assumption that humans are social, and because humans are social, learning as a human activity is also social activity. So I think, as you, Mark, mentioned, that there is also an assumption that creativity is human and sociability is human. If those two assumptions truly underline your presentation, what is then the role of the academy as an institution, the role of the academy, I mean, art and design academy, in relation to those two human qualities that underline your
Okay, I'm gonna start answering the question, and I understand how you come to those assumptions. So my goal, I don't always stand in the street or in the crossing at CSM. What I do on a day-to-day basis is I work across the whole college with all our disciplines, whether it's fashion, jewelry, fine art, graphic design, product design, industrial design, and we constantly question what is our role as designers and artists, what are our responsibilities, and how can we enable our students to develop this agency in a world around us that is going more and more crazy. How can we, as designers, we don't need to design anymore. There is enough stuff in the world. What can we do in terms of contingency? How can we change the way the process is? So that's where the social comes in. How can we work with the society around us to change the way how we are using the material that we have got, or as beautifully shown by one of the students, Daniel, who worked with algae here, how can we use other forms of materials that we have at our disposal and create materials we think we need. But that's why I question the methods that we are all using at the moment. They all were born out of modernity, and that whole project of modernity, which we all still rely on, and we all use the references. Many of us were trained within that framework, but with what we're facing in the world, it's no longer what we have different, you talk about aims and the intentions we have. Our aims and intentions have to change. Otherwise, this world cannot exist as it does at the moment. And I don't want to talk so darkly, and it goes into, we also have to really understand different cultures. So if I talk about the UK context, inequality is so obvious, especially if you go in the art school. We work with students who come from very different, but our student cohorts are far more diverse than our staffing body. And those students come with very different questions, and they rightly ask for their backgrounds to be acknowledged and recognized within the academy, because who's to say that the histories that we've been working with over the last 50, 100, whatever years, that's just one, we call it the Western canon. We rely so much on it. But how come an African artist, for example, has got very different interpretation, and if you look at some of the African nations, how they've worked with material, they have progressed far more. And obviously the UK has to do with the colonial question, all of that. And how did the colonies, how did all of those politics affect where we are? So we're in this real turmoil at the moment, and this is where we have to have these conversations. We can no longer avoid them, because if we want this world to continue and we want to work together, this is not one person's task. It's impossible. we really need to listen to each other, and we need to be very open to other interpretations and other there isn't a single story. For far too long there was a single story, but now if we embrace all of the stories, we feel as an institution there is still hope. But if we continue, so in a way, the institution, to answer your question finally, the institution, we believe it should provide the platform where these conversations can happen, because they cannot, it's about being confident, it's about, I don't like the word resilient, but I can't think of a different one. We're constantly working on this. But it's about how can we all support each other, that we can challenge what's happening in society, and we can go out there and work. We work a lot with local communities around. In London, or in the UK, it's called the borough, the area that you're in. We sit right between one of the poorest boroughs and one of the richest boroughs. So we work with council estates, we work with prisons, we have a centre designed against crime, and the industrial students will go into prisons and work with prisoners on how to design bags that are not that easy snatched. So, so we've developed these relationships, and we're listening to those communities, because we don't have the answers. It's very much about people having a different life experience, people living in housing that's too small. What can the designer do? There is no more housing. So how can we use the housing that we have? Can we design other kind of furniture? So our students work with so this is like social housing I'm talking about. They working with the tenants and think about how can we can't move anywhere else. We don't want to move to a different part in the UK. We want to stay in London, but there is a limitation to the housing. So how do we respond to this challenge together? What do we need? So there are the kids, they want a desk, they want to do their homework. Then there is the grandma who's also living there. What are the needs of the grandma? And how can we work together with it? So again, this is about agency. So the community has the agency to work with us, and this is our students are learning the ethics of their practice, and what ethical implications does their design, their art practice have on the environment that they're working in. Of course.
Maybe Mark will answer first.
Picking up on the ethics, I think for me the role of the academy increasingly is a really simple one. And I've recently supervised a student who based his work on the German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer. And he's more of an expert than I am. He's actually read Truth and Method from cover to cover. But increasingly I think that the purpose, the function should be that of understanding, that fusion of horizons. So understanding each other, being prepared to say, when you say that, what do you mean? And when I hear that, I interpret it in this way. And that is ethical foundation for practice. So yeah, very simple. I think the role of the academy is to foster understanding.
We collect now maybe like 2 or 3 questions together, and then maybe you can answer them.
May I just say one more thing? I think Zygmunt Bauman and Emanuel Levinas were both individuals who've written a lot about ethics and about other and ethics and how the self cannot exist without the other. So this is also about bringing the different people together. And I think, this was written many years ago, but it's really relevant now. So those are writers. I'm not sure if you familiar with them, but their thinking is so relevant in our practices now that we really must revisit that.
So let's take a few questions. Someone more wants to raise a question? Yeah? And? Okay.
Yes, but shortly, just to talk about the problematic, I don't mean to bring any answer right now because there is no time, but I think that it's a questioning which is important regarding your thoughts and the talk that you do, and you as a teacher, as a person part of the academy, and us working, of course, guided by ethical problematics and intentions, and of course encouraging the students to take in consideration as a dictate the environment, and I should say the world, instead of the environment. But my question is, and it's also to myself, how can we avoid the objective separation and division between the inside of the academy and the outside? I think the main intention is to produce truth and not to be designer or artists who are charlatans, because it doesn't work and it doesn't sell anymore today. And so all this is a problematic that I put now because it's a beautiful world. It's very nice to think together about it, but we can conclude that it's complicated to make it, to put it in practice seriously in the extraterritoriality of the academy.
Okay, thank you.
First of all, thank you. The question I would like to ask is about talk about creativity, in which for quite a lot of time I heard about all the different ways that we use that word to the point that it has become a slogan and doesn't really have any meaning. You can equally say that art is creativity and creativity is art, if you like. But my question is different as an educator, and not as someone who is coming from a media of words. How do we teach creativity? And not what are all the different usages of that slogan. When you talk about that toaster will never work because it has to be plugged in. And if it's plugged in, there has to be electricity. I want to know, where is that electricity? Not turning on and off creativity. I do not think that can be done. It is not something that you can turn on and off like a switch. There's electricity. I want a program about how do we teach creativity. Do you have such a program?
Well, I can sit and listen now. Let's come to your table now.
No, but I suppose what I would say is you define your terms of reference before you design your program. So when you say this program is about teaching creativity, you need to talk about what did you mean by that, rather than assuming that it's this sort of universal thing. Because I think, all I really did was to show that it is a problematic concept and it cannot be treated as a universal. So if we sidestep the universal and we try to think of, okay, when I say creativity, I mean this, this, and this, then I can now design a program. And back to that idea of sharing and understanding. I know what I mean, my students know what I mean. We might even talk about the investment in a creative identity. I've taught students who are so obsessed with the idea that they are creative, that determines the way that they move through the world and what they do in the world and how they interpret their own work, without necessarily critiquing the details of that. So, but if by a programmer to nurture creativity, you mean a program by the end of which will create this set of, you know, people who are producing things that are impressive, because sometimes that's what we mean in an artistic context, then I guess you need to look at what it is you want the outcomes are going to be. How do you visualise the outcomes? How do you imagine the outcomes and work backwards from that? And whatever you call it, in a way, is irrelevant. I mean, if you want to use the shibboleth, creativity, you could use it, but it has to be shared understanding. That's not the answer you wanted, I guess.
Thank you. I'm thinking we don't have the time. Maybe we can continue this in the break. Silke, do you want to add something to
the words that come to my mind listening to this? Yes, you need to have some principles and a framework within which you work. Mistake, failure, mistaken, experimentation. They need, I think, again, that's the role of the academy, to create that space for our students and staff, and do this together. And for me, all of these words I just used, they are part of the creative engagement or creative endeavor. But you may disagree with that, but then we use your definition and my definition, and I think together we can. It's about enabling or creating some kind of tools or methods that will enable students, that bring out the creativity.
Thank you.
But we don't have a program that is called We're Teaching Creativity.
Thank you, Silke. Thank you, Mark. We'll go on a break now until 12 o'clock when we start the next session. Thank you for insightful morning.